watching. Now this week I'm so excited to share another cake decorating technique with you. In this video I'm going to be showing you how I stack my tiered cakes. So whether you're new to stacking cakes and you want to attempt your first tiered cake, or if you just want to see how I do it, in this video tutorial I'm going to be showing you how I prepare, dowel and stack a 3-tier cake. Now this cake is going to be covered in fondant, but I will be going through in the video some little tips if you are covering your cakes in buttercream. Now before I jump in with the actual cake, I thought it was probably worth mentioning why we actually add dowels into our cakes. Now the whole reason for this is because of the weight. Now you might create the lightest, fluffiest sponge cakes, but if you take into consideration all the ingredients, the filling, maybe the fondant on top, the cake is going to weigh quite a lot. So when this is stacked on other cakes, all that weight is going to push down on the cakes below it. So by adding in dowels with cake boards on the top, you're going to create a really strong structure inside to keep your cake nice and straight and stop it from collapsing on itself. Now when thinking about dowels and cake boards, I like to think of the structure that we're creating in terms of a table. So we're creating a table which sits inside the cake, which the next tier sits on top of, and the table just supports it. So if we think about our dowels and we think about our cake boards, the dowels are the legs of your table. If you didn't have a cake board and you just pop the dowels in, then as the weight of the cake pushes down, the dowels are just going to go up. So we need to add a cake board on in order to rest on top of those dowels. Now if you think about it as a table, if the legs of your table are different heights, you're going to have a wobbly table. Another thing is if your dowel doesn't go completely straight, or maybe the bottom of your dowel is slightly angled, this is going to make the table leg either angle in or angle out. Now once the weight is bearing down on the top, any movement is going to push that table leg in and allow your table to collapse. So we're just trying to create a really stable structure inside the cake. I mean, it's really unusual that a cake is going to stay in the exact position where you build it. So a cake is always going to have a slight movement, whether you're just carrying it from one place to another, or if your cake is being transported. Now remember, it might not always be you that is transporting the cake. Maybe a customer is picking the cake up and popping it in their car. So you need to make sure that the structure that you're building inside can take any movement and isn't going to cause the cake to slide or collapse. Now, one thing to consider when traveling with a tiered cake is to think about whether you need to deliver the cake completely stacked. Maybe if it's a 2 or 3 tier cake, then you're more than happy to pop it in the car and drive it as it is. But if you've got 4 or 5 tiers, then consider taking it in different parts. So if it's a 4-tier cake, you might split it up so you've got 2 2-tier cakes that you can finish stacking at the venue. This is just going to allow for less pressure on that structure inside. Okay, so now we've covered that, let's jump in to the cake. In this video, I'm going to be stacking a 5-inch on top of a 7-inch on top of a 9-inch cake. Now, I always try and leave 2 inches between the sizes of my cakes, and this just gives you around 1 inch on each side, and I just think this looks aesthetically pleasing. So the best place to probably start is at the bottom of the cake. Now, one of the most important things is the board that the whole cake is going to sit on. If we think about all those tiers together and how much weight that is going to be, if anyone has ever lifted a tiered cake, they weigh so much. So you need a really sturdy cake board on the bottom that isn't going to bend or flex with the weight if you try and move it. So I'm going to be using a 13-inch drum board. Now this one measures 1 centimeter in height, and you just can't bend the board, so it's perfect to take the weight on top. Now you can also get boards that have MDF inside, or just one that is really strong. Now if we consider a cake card, something like this, even if it's a bigger size, completely bends under weight. So this isn't going to be able to take the weight of your tiered cake on the top. So now I get to the stage where I'm going to prepare each of my cakes ready for stacking. I've actually got some 6-inch cakes and I'm going to cut these down, and these are going to be my 5-inch cakes. I've got my 7-inch cakes and my 9-inch cakes. Now for all of the cakes, I've actually baked 2 separate cakes. I'm going to level these off and cut each one into 2 layers, so the cakes will end up as 4 layers in total. Now after baking these, I've had them wrapped in cling film and popped them in the fridge to make it a lot easier to cut them and fill them. But once they return to room temperature, they will go back to being nice and fluffy. Now, as I've mentioned, each cake is going to have to go on its own individual cake board in order to sit on top of my dowels. So for these ones, I'm going to be using exactly the same kind of board that we're using for the base of the cake. So I've got 3 different drum boards, a 9, a 7 and a 5, just to match up to the size of the cakes. Now, if I'm making a tiered cake, I always make sure that the cakes are sitting on exactly the same kind of board. And the reason for this is different boards come in different heights. So if you know that they're all on the same one, all of your tiers are going to remain exactly the same height. Now, just to give you some different examples of different cake boards, I've got this one, which is quite a firm cake board and measures around 2 millimeters in height. Now there is a small amount of movement, but it is quite a rigid board. So I usually use these if I'm making a 2-tier cake, but anything above a 2-tier cake, then I would definitely use more of a drum board so that I know that that cake isn't going to move at all. So I'm going to start going in and leveling off all of my cakes. Now for my 6-inch cake, I want to trim this down so it's actually a 5-inch cake. So I'm going to use the cake board that the cake is going to sit on, turn this upside down and use a serrated knife around the edge. I'm then going to fill and cover my cakes with a layer of white chocolate ganache. Now ganache is a great filling for cakes, especially if you're covering them in fondant, and the reason that I like using ganache is just because it firms up a lot more than buttercream, especially in hot weather. Now one thing that is going to make it a lot easier when it comes to adding the dowels into your cake and stacking your tiers is to make sure that each of your cakes is nice and level. So throughout this process, I'm going to be using this really small spirit level that I just got from a DIY shop, and this is just going to allow me to check at different stages of filling and covering my cakes that my cake is remaining nice and flat on the top. So I'm going to start and cover my board in a layer of ganache just to stick down my cake, and then go ahead and fill and cover my cakes. First of all, I'm going to cover them in a crumb coat just to lock in any loose crumbs before I go in with the final layer. Now I will put a full video showing how I prepare and cover my cakes in the description below, so you can go ahead and watch that. Now for this final coating, I want this to be as smooth as I can get it, with nice sharp edges on the top, so that it's a nice base for us to add our fondant onto. Also, don't forget to keep using the spirit level just to make sure that our cakes remain nice and flat on the top. If you find that you struggle when you're cutting your layers using a serrated knife and they're not getting quite even, then you can buy a leveling tool which just has a thin wire that you can set at different heights and run this over each of your cakes. Now I've had my cakes in the fridge and that ganache has firmed up, so they're now ready for me to cover in fondant. For the fondant, I'm going to be using the sugar paste. Now if you do want to see a more detailed video of how I cover my boards and my cakes in fondant, I will put a link in the description below. I'm then going to colour some of my sugar paste in a light pink colour and use this to cover my cakes. Now when I'm covering my cakes in fondant, if I am creating a tiered cake, I try to make sure that I leave enough time in order to cover the cakes the day before I need to stack it. The reason for this is to allow time for that fondant to slightly harden on the outside. This means that when you pick the cake up in order to put it on the lower tiers, you can actually push your hands onto the side without leaving any finger marks. Okay, so I've got the 3 tiers of my cake that have been resting overnight just for that fondant to firm up slightly. So now our cakes are at that stage where we're ready to add our dowels. Now Now, there are so many dowels on the market, and I know that sometimes it can be a little daunting to know which one to choose. Now, I have a few examples here, and these are all ones that I have experience with using. Now, when choosing cake dowels, I personally prefer to use ones that have been created by companies within the cake industry, just because when they sell them, they usually tell you how many tiers they can support. So some of them might only be able to support up to 3 tiers, and some of them, like some of the ones that I have here, can support even higher. Now, the first dowels that I have are the bamboo wooden dowels. Now, these are great because they are a solid dowel that is really strong and doesn't bend. When choosing your dowels, you want to choose something that is food safe and either made of wood or food safe plastic. You also want something that is going to stay nice and rigid and isn't going to bend or buckle under the weight that you're applying on the top. Now, with wooden dowels, you can't use scissors, so you either need a tool that you can cut through the wood or a small little hacksaw. One little tip if you are using wooden dowels or some of the plastic ones is to also get a small piece of sandpaper. This way, if when you cut the bottom of your dowel it isn't quite straight, or you have little bits of wood or plastic sticking up, you can just use the sandpaper just to smooth that down so that you know it's completely flat when you push it into the cake. Now, another dowel that I have here, these are the easy cut dowels. Now, these ones you cut with scissors, and there are a few different brands like this. You also have the PME easy cut dowels. These are a much thinner dowel, but they're still quite strong, and as you can see, they don't bend. They have a circle opening at the end, but quite a thick amount of plastic around the edge, which gives you a good surface area for your cake board to sit on. Now, with these ones, the companies say that you should only use them up to 3 tiers. Now, for my last example, it is probably the dowel that I use most often, and this is the poly dowel. Now, these are a lot thicker of a dowel, and they are so strong that you can't bend them. If we have a look at the end of the dowel, even though it's hollow, you've got these extra bits of plastic that have been added that run all the way down the length of the dowel, and this is just to add extra strength, and it also gives you more surface area for your cake board to rest on. Now, with these ones, I do usually use the small hacksaw just to cut into them, but you can use these for as many tiers as you like. Now, when I'm stacking my cake, I always use the same dowels throughout the whole cake, but for this tutorial I am going to be using 2 different ones just so you can see the difference. So the first cake I'm going to be working on is my 9-inch cake, and this is going to be the one that is going to sit directly on my cake board. First thing we want to do is create a guide on the top of our cake so that we know where the next tier is going to go. This is going to help us know where to put the dowels, and also as a guide when we bring our cake on top. For this, I'm going to be using the loose base of my cake tin, which I baked my 7-inch cake in, but you can also use a spare cake board or just create a circle the right size on a piece of card. Now, whatever marks we put on the top of the cake will be covered because this is the size of the original cake before we added our ganache and our fondant. Place that on top of my cake. Take a ruler, go in and make sure that that's sitting exactly in the center. You can either use a cocktail stick or a Dresden tool, running that around the disc just so I leave a really light imprint. For this tier, I'm going to be using the poly dowels. So these ones have the centimeter opening at the end. When we're placing our dowels into our cake, we want to think of them as if we're placing table legs. So if the dowels were too close to the center, it's going to make the tier above quite wobbly. We want to come in around 1 inch to 1.5 inches, depending on how big your tier is, from this line that we've created. Now, in terms of how many dowels we're going to need, the dowels are usually spaced around 2 inches apart from each other. How many you need really does depend on the type of dowels that you're using. Obviously, these ones are a lot thinner than the poly dowels, so you might need maybe 1 or 2 more to spread them out evenly. It's usually about 1 or 2 less than the size tier that's going on top. So with the poly dowels, I'm going to be adding 5. Now, I want to again take my small spirit level, check my cake. Now, what we're looking for is if there is an area of the cake that is slightly higher than the rest. If there is, this is going to be the position position that we start in. The reason for doing this is we want all of our dowels to be the same size. So they're all going to be based off of the size of the first dowel that we add in. If that dowel is shorter than the rest of your cake and it pushes further in, when we put our next tier on top, that cake is going to push in. So I'm going to take my poly dowel, so this is uncut, and I'm going to come in around an inch and just push all the way down until it stops and I know that it's hit on that board that is at the bottom. I've then got an edible pen, mark on my dowel. I've just brought a cake tin in to rest my dowel onto, but I would usually just do this on the side of my worktop. I'm going to be using this small hacksaw. Now you can also use maybe a bread knife, or if you've got something that can cut plastic. Now I'm going to cut my dowel along that line that we created. Go in with a pair of scissors and just chop any loose bits of plastic, and this is the same if you're using wooden dowels. Take a small piece of sandpaper to make sure that that's nice and smooth. Now in order to do the next board, use the one that we have as a guide. I can then do exactly the same and cut them out until I'm left with all 5 of my dowels. With the scissors, I'm not altering the size of my dowel at all. I'm just taking off any loose bits of plastic on the edge. You just want to wipe those down and make sure that there's no little bits of plastic. Measure them against each other. So if any of them are looking slightly high, just trim that off. Bring my cake back in, pop my first dowel, and I'm going to push that all the way down, making sure that you keep the dowel as straight as possible as you push it into the cake. To make sure they're all completely level, I've just got my spirit level again, and I'm going to place that on top of my dowels. If any of them are slightly too high, you just want to pull one out and just trim it off until you know it's completely flat. So I'm going to do exactly the same with my 7-inch. I've then got a 5-inch cake board that I'm going to pop on the top of the cake, mark around the edge. Again, before I add my first dowel, I just want to check that that cake is nice and flat. For this one, I'm going to be using the easy cut dowels. Now with this one, I'm going to do exactly the same. So I'm going to come in around an inch and just push that all the way through the cake until I hit the bottom of the board, whilst trying to keep the dowel as straight as possible. Mark on the top of my cake and just bring that out. With these ones, I can use a pair of scissors to cut that. Now again, exactly the same as with the other ones, I'm going to use this as a guide. Pop my first dowel back into the cake and then come around 2 inches, push the next one down. Check in where all those dowels are sitting. Now when I use my spirit level, this one is sitting slightly lower. Now one reason for that could be that it hasn't gone in completely straight. So I'm going to take that out, re-push that in, making sure that I keep it straight. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, it's so important that they are level and they have gone in straight. If you do put another cake on the top and one of your dowels is slightly crooked, if there is any movement, or maybe the cake is on an uneven surface and it is pushing towards that side, if your dowel isn't straight and is already leaning out, it actually creates a weak point throughout the cake. So if you know that the dowels are completely straight, all the weight from above is distributed evenly throughout all of the dowels. Okay, so now both cakes have the dowels added. We're now ready to stack the cake. Starting with my drum board, and I'm going to do exactly the same as I did with the cakes and pop the 9-inch base. I'm marking this on just as a guide so that I know when I pop my cake down where I'm aiming for. Now, personally, I find that royal icing is the best type of glue to use on fondant cakes. So we're sticking the underside of our cake boards onto the fondant. And the great thing about royal icing is once you've applied it and you've stacked your cakes, you just need to leave it for around half an hour to an hour to firm up before you move the cake. But as a glue, it really isn't affected by heat. Another thing you could use for glue is ganache, as this also is a lot firmer than something like buttercream. You just need to be aware that whatever you're using, if it does get hot and it starts to melt, it could mean that your cakes move around. Now I will be coming to buttercream cakes and giving another tip to what you can do to stop any movement happening. Put a layer of my royal icing on my board. Now I'm making sure that I come around 1.5 inches in from where I made my guide mark so that none of that royal icing oozes out from the bottom, but you want to give a nice coating so that there's enough glue on there. And carefully guide that cake into position. Now, because that royal icing hasn't set yet, I'm able to go in and just slightly move that cake around, taking a paddle smoother, and then just going to push down where we've got those dowels on the top. You then want your royal icing, making sure that I run over where my dowels are. Now for this one, I'm just going to lift it up and just guide that into place. So this really is the reason why we left the cake overnight, just for that fondant to firm up so that you can go in and move it really easily. Now I'm going to add the final tier on the top. Now you can go in where you've got those joins with some royal icing that you've coloured in the same colour, or I'm just hiding the joins with some matching pink ribbon. Your tiered cake is all ready to decorate exactly how you want. So here we have the 3-tier stacked cake. Now I am going to talk about a centre dowel, as I know some of you might be wondering, why haven't I put a centre dowel all the way through? Now with fondant cakes, when I use royal icing, in the UK our boards are so thick, I don't tend to put a centre dowel all the way through because I find that that is enough to keep it glued together. Now if you're using ganache, and definitely if you're using buttercream, you want to put a dowel all the way through the center of your cake. What this is going to do is run through all the boards to stabilize the cake and stop them moving, as when buttercream starts to warm up, it really starts to allow your cakes to slide. With the drum boards being quite thick, what you want to do if you are putting a center dowel in is pre-drill a hole through the center. You can then use a dowel, and when you're stacking your cake, bring your cakes down onto your dowel, or you can go in at the end and just push your dowel all the way through your cake. This is then going to sit between your boards, so you might have another board up here, and it's just going to help hold those boards in place if any of that buttercream does start to get a bit soft and your cake starts to move. So there we have how I prepare, dowel and stack my tiered cakes. I really hope you found this video useful, and if you're embarking on maybe a tiered birthday cake or even a tiered wedding cake, that this video will be useful in guiding you through the process. Now I will put a list in the description below to all the tools that I've used throughout today's video, including all the examples of the dowels that I mentioned. If you have enjoyed the video, then make sure you give it a like, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, then don't forget to subscribe to the Cakes by Lindsay YouTube channel. So until next time, bye!